連中だと抜かすかこの不心得者が
Father Mozgus origins. Brutal Inquisitor who thought God made him a pseudo-apostle. Explored. Religion wasn't exactly a core theme of Berserk for a long time, until series creator Kentaro Miura saw The Name of the Rose and decided to make an Inquisitor the main antagonist of the Conviction arc. I mean, yes, it was a part of the narrative, but not its main focus, which it seems to have become ever since Father Mozgus stepped into the scene. A brutal man whose faith is stronger than Grunbeld's skin, Mozgus is more fanatic than faithful, but he does serve an important purpose in Berserk, and that is showing just how easily the line between heaven and hell has been blurred by the existence of the God Hand. His sense of justice is absolute. While you might think that that's a good thing, remember how the people of Westeros view Stannis Baratheon. You'll see why divine justice is something to be feared. Having said all of this, let's stop beating around the bush and dive straight into it. This is Father Mozgus's origins. Explored. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. He is based off history's most famous Inquisitor, the inspiration behind Father Mozgus. Before we get to Father Mozgus's story, let's talk about the man who likely inspired his character and give you a bit of context about his own divisive life. An Inquisitor is a religious official whose job is to literally inquire after the existence of heretics in a given domain and then systematically root them out using various methods at their disposal. Kentaro Miura's particular inspiration seems to come from the Spanish Inquisition, which is one of three major inquisitional movements known to history, and the man who inspired his creation was called Bernardo Guy. Guy was an exceptional inquisitor in his day, and is said to have convicted 636 offenders on 940 counts of heresy. Since Catholic doctrine prevented the inquisitors from spilling any blood, it was general consensus back then that Guy condemned around 600 people to the burning stake, making him one of the worst human rights offenders by modern standards. But modern research has also shown that that belief might have been exaggerated. 20th century historians James Given and Joseph Dane's works suggest that the actual number of heretical burnings that were conducted by Guy was 45, which is about 7% of the people he was accused of sending to the stake. Most others were either left imprisoned or were ordered to wear a cross, with 9 people being sent on compulsory pilgrimages as a result of their offenses. But that doesn't mean that torture was not involved in Bernardo Guy's Inquisition. The Tower of Conviction, which is the main site of the Conviction arc of Berserk, is based off the Alcázar de los Reyes Cristianos, a medieval palace located in Spain, which became an amusement park for torturers during the Inquisition. It is said that everything within the palace, even the Arabic baths that were created by the Umayyad Caliphate during their occupation of the fortress, were turned into vessels for inflicting physical torment. It is noted that the Spanish Inquisitors were far more lenient than their Roman counterparts in inflicting torture. For instance, Spanish Inquisitors only allowed 15 minutes of torment to be inflicted upon offenders, whilst the Roman statute demanded 30. That is decidedly less cruel, sure, but it is cruel nonetheless. The Name of the Rose, which is the movie that inspired Miura to create Father Mozgus, picks up every negative aspect of the Inquisition and takes it to the extreme, but it can also be argued that the Inquisition itself was a product of its time. The idea of divine justice being inflicted upon those who do not accept their doctrine is what lied at the heart of the Inquisitor's holy task, and that is something that is unfathomable in modern society. This is why the very idea of an Inquisition is revolting to us personally, and thus, it makes sense that Miura would use it to create his most disgusting character in Berserk, at least according to us. Because Father Mozgus didn't just inflict torture upon poor souls, he truly believed doing so was helping them, and that is where faith becomes fanaticism, and therefore dangerous. So now that you have the appropriate historical context for his introduction to the story, let's look at his story itself. His reputation precedes him quite literally, the introduction of bloody scripture Mozgus. Father Mozgus is one of those villains whose reputation precedes him quite literally, and he does not fail to deliver on it with a quick follow-up either. In chapter 131 of Berserk, we learn that after Farnese's failure at capturing the Black Swordsman and the loss of many members of the Holy See Nation's nobility during her campaign, she's been reassigned to protection duty for an Inquisition. Thousands of refugees trying to escape the woes of plague, famine, and war breaking out all over Midland are flocking toward the holy city of St. Albion, and so is one of the most notorious inquisitors of the Holy See. As the higher-ups of the clergy debate ways in which they can manipulate the prophetic dream of the Falcon of Light to suit their doctrine, they need to clear the path of heretics who have gathered at one of their most important religious sites. In order to do that, they've dispatched their best inquisitor, whose success rate is a blessing for the Holy See, but a waking nightmare for the general population. As Farnese struggles with her, let's say, eye-opening experiences with guts, Best Boy Serpico is the one who prepares us for someone who is even more unhinged than his mistress by musing that his current job would be dispiriting even without her presence by his side. We learn the reason behind these dreary thoughts from the throng of people blocking the path of the Holy Iron Chain Knights. A civilian immediately shushes all those around him trying to criticize the people crossing their path at the moment, pointing out the massive white steel-plated Inquisitor's carriage to them, and the 4 crimson wheels that adorned its roofing. Some of the gathered crowd didn't quite understand what that was supposed to mean, so he decides to use the reputation of the man inside the carriage to make his fellow man understand just how gravely endangered their lives were about to become. The Inquisitor was called Blood Scripture Mozgus, and no sooner had the name escaped his lips than the squalor turned into a frightful rage. Breaking on the wheel, stake burning, waterboarding. These were just some of the methods that this bloody Inquisitor had employed to purge supposed heretics from the lands of the Holy See. It was said that under Mozgus's judgment, 500 people had been put to death under suspicion of heresy, with hundreds of others losing their lives to his tormenting method of inquisition. A single mole could make him think that you're a heretic, and he had personally accrued casualties to his name that were more akin to warfare. It was for this reason that Mozgus was the object of many people's malice and spite, and we see this play out in real time as a group of crossbowmen ambush the carriage. The revenge-seeking mob managed to outflank the Holy Iron Chain Knights and breach the carriage door, but that's about as far as they got. At that moment, 6 beast-like men stepped out of the vehicle to inflict God's bloody justice upon these heathen offenders. One of them wielded a metallic, claw-like contraption which was tied at the end of a chain. Another used his massive size and massive breaking wheel to, well, break people. A pair of torturers who looked like they were twins used 2 huge bandsaws in conjunction to make a pair of scissors fatal to humans. An impish figure put pliers to such horrifying uses that you'd start wearing welding goggles everywhere you went. And finally, there is the man-catcher wielding, plague doctor mask wearing dude who is the only torturer who didn't actively kill someone in their retaliatory attack. The scene of carnage was met by a surprising request for silence by a figure emerging from within the carriage. And that is when we finally get our first glimpse of Father Mozgus. And we can just say, every time Miura draws a close-up of his face, we get the creeps, because it is flat as a whetstone, and so unsettling that even priest-like declarations like, "The Lord doth revere silence," come off as sinister and malevolent. Farnese immediately begs his forgiveness for failing to protect him properly. But Father Mozgus is magnanimous even in the face of prospective death. He declares that it is God's mercy that none of their Holy See adherents lost their lives in the ambush, and that Farnese had nothing to feel humbled about. When she asks him who those men who hopped out of the carriage were, Mozgus openly proclaims them his torturers. Men with iron wills cultivated through harsh discipline who are protectors and executioners at the same time. He calls them useful to himself in these times of crises, and while Farnese admires their abilities, Azan is dubious of their brutality, whilst Serpico only has a thought to spare for Mozgus's style. The Inquisitor orders his men to line up the attackers so he could listen to their reason for attacking him, in a move made seemingly to administer strict justice. But we quickly find out what Mozgus's definition of justice is, and that is arbitrary declaration based on his personal will. The man being questioned by him reveals revenge as his primary motivation, claiming that Mozgus burned his entire village down because they suggested temporarily suspending their offerings to the church in light of the recent famine. Instead, he declared the village as a refuge for heretics and had it burned, whilst the men were away at work, killing women and children and calling it fair judgment in the same breath with which he called it misfortune. The attacker was outraged by the Inquisitor's insensitivity to his own torturous deeds and declared that divine judgment would be brought down upon Mozgus's head, which is where we learned his trigger phrase. Because someone else claiming God for their own made every vein in Father Mozgus's face swell up with self-righteous rage, and we do mean that literally. He is furious at the fact that an apostate would try to claim the will of God in the presence of a priest, when that right only belongs to the Holy See. He smashes the offender so hard on his head that it instantly kills him, and he asks an impressed Farnese that, as the commander of the Holy Iron Chain Knights, what should be done with them. When she gave him the textbook answer, Father Mozgus applauds her awareness and passes the sentence, death by the wheel. His henchmen waste no time in making an example out of the mob that had set out to kill their savior, and Farnese de Vandimian had found a new light in Mozgus's brutality. The pair proceeded toward the Tower of Conviction filled with a sense of religious fervor, and this is where things somehow get even more unsettling. A fanatic who believes pain is a part of his faith, Father Mozgus in the Tower of Conviction. As Mozgus's entourage enters the holy city of St. Albion, they are once again mobbed by a throng of starving commoners who dare to ask them for more alms. Farnese acts quickly in protecting offerings being brought to the Tower of Conviction, but her own convictions are given pause when one of the starved mob, a mother with a dying child, pleads for divine protection for her kid. This throws Farnese off completely because she has no idea what to do in such a situation, but she doesn't need to know. Father Mozgus is there to save the day. He declares that the mother's undying love for her child, which made her break the law, and his gentle heart, which bore witness to it, were surely an act of God. He decreed that she and her dying babe would be brought to the tower along with the rest of the mob for their faithful service to begin. Farnese is once again filled with admiration for the man who has clearly become the apple of her eye, as he takes the bold mother's child to the tower's physician and saves its life from certain death. But then he says something that is rather disconcerting. Mozgus states that the child shall bear the weight of payment later, but its mother, who was thanking him profusely, would do so now. He guides her to an ominous-looking door, and when it is thrown open, a scene that can only be described as gruesome awaits our eyes. Inside this chamber, Mozgus's disciples are hard at work, punishing heretics and offenders, as well as carrying out his inquisition with such terrifying zeal that they could be mistaken for demons. The Inquisitor remarks that this is the first time that Farnese has stepped inside this part of the Tower of Conviction, but reminds her that this too is a part of their faith. The holy ground of Albion had been plagued not just by disease, famine, and debauchery, it was also a breeding ground for heretics. Priests had been getting transformed into grisly displays of warning to the sea for many days, but now they had finally been hitting them back. Mozgus rants that God doesn't simply rain down benevolence from heaven. He is also a strict arbiter, and though the mother's mercy was a beautiful thing, sin was still sin. He breaks into a maniacally fervent expression as he prays she survives her ordeal better than her fellow starving brethren who were also being tortured as they spoke. But this isn't the most unsettling part of the whole thing. After seeing the hellish scene unfolding in front of her eyes, Farnese is horrified and turns away from it, but Mozgus steps in behind her like a towering specter and commands her to not avert her eyes from her duty. Chapter 135 is one of the most visually grotesque chapters in all of Berserk, and yet it is this one bloodless panel of Mozgus staring at Farnese with his apostle-like eyes that gives us constant nightmares. The Holy Iron Chain Knights were only supposed to be on protection duty for the Inquisitor, but because of Farnese's admiration for Mozgus, she had practically made it his private army. Her men were questioning her decisions openly in the mess hall of the Tower of Conviction, and she overheard all of it, which caused her to seek out the Inquisitor once again. As she made her way to his whereabouts, she came across the twin torturers who worked for Father Mozgus, playing with crows. Their faces looked misshapen, and she had seen them commit acts of great violence before, but now they seemed almost childlike and innocent. As she continued on, she came across the disciple who wears the Plague Doctor mask and inquires about the good father's location. He tells her Mozgus is in the chapel, and offers to lead her and Serpico to him. As they make their way to the Inquisitor, the crow senses Farnese's morbid fascination with the twins, and breaks into a story that gives us an idea of the kinder side of Father Mozgus. He takes off his own mask and reveals the face of a reasonably handsome man underneath, but when he puts his hand underneath the sun's rays, it starts to blister and crackle like pork skin. He explains to Farnese and Serpico that because of this ailment he was persecuted and savagely abused by his own villagers and thought he might die alone, until Father Mozgus saved him. Mozgus told him that his condition and his intense emotions were not without purpose. They were needed by God because he had decreed so. And for the first time, The crow felt a true miracle happen in his life. Mozgus had saved him and the rest of his disciples from a similar fate, and that was proof that they had been brought together for a purpose. He tells his children that they will be reviled and hated for their appearance and their future work, but the Holy See's scriptures held no contempt for their kind, and thus they should be proud of what they do in his service and have faith above all else. The crow tells Farnese and Serpico that he was overcome with emotion when he had his existence reaffirmed for him by Father Mozgus, as did all of his fellow torturers, and that was one of the main reasons they continued to serve him. He personally did not enjoy the act of torture in his more reflective moments, so perhaps he had become a monster after all, but he could go on because he believed his duty to be divinely ordained. This shows us two things. Father Mozgus isn't the only fanatic in his crew. All his crew are about as hardline with their faith as he is, and number two, even his kindness comes laced with the concept of service behind it. If you think about it objectively and take the religious aspect out of it, he picked the most downtrodden elements of society, rehabilitated them to gain their absolute loyalty, and now uses them as his personal tools. That's something cartel and cult leaders do in the modern world. But when you add that aspect in, you can see just how complex Miura's expression of faith is in Berserk. Earlier in the story, Guts used to be disgusted by religious adherents who could do nothing but pray their problems away. This was one of the main things that made him regard Farnese with ridicule. But that same inaction has been immediately contrasted with the most drastic kind of fanatical devotion in the span of a few chapters. It's just one of the examples of Kentaro Miura's storytelling genius, but we're getting off track. Farnese and Serpico hear Father Mozgus before they see him in the chapel, and it isn't because he's singing a hymn with his booming voice either. For the last 10 years of his life, Mozgus had cultivated a routine of performing 1,000 prostrations day and night as a way of expressing his faith. What Farnese and Serpico were hearing was his worship. Serpico thinks to himself that this explains his flat face, but Farnese is concerned at the reckless abandon with which the Inquisitor commits himself to his worship. Mozgus slammed his knees on the floor of the chapel so hard that they were bleeding, and the Inquisitor begs her pardon not for the bloody display, but because he had failed to notice it. He explains that he hardly felt his legs anymore, but as we've noted before, pain is a part of his faith. As the crow bandages his knees, he tells Farnese an interesting story about the Tower of Conviction from 1,000 years ago that seems to be his personal inspiration as an Inquisitor. An angel of pain and a demon of death. Father Mozgus's role in the incarnation ceremony. It was said that in the age of Supreme King Geiseric, when all of Midland was a part of his great capital city, including the tower they stood in, there was a sage. This sage would proclaim the many sins he witnessed in Geiseric's declining capital city to God on a daily basis, but his proclamations were unacceptable for the Skull King. He had the sage imprisoned within the Tower of Conviction and had him tortured in every possible way, and yet the sage continued to chant out Geiseric's sins into the ether in hopes of God smiting him. And then, one day, an angel was made to descend, after which the Skull King's capital city was destroyed by the cardinal angels mentioned in scripture. He says that the Tower of Conviction surely must have holy significance for such a martyr was born within its walls. But if you want to know the truth about this story, we suggest you go and check out our Void Origins video right now. Mozgus continues rambling into a sermon about how pain itself is related to his devotion. He says that the sensation of pain would soon return to his legs, that because of his prostration he can barely walk, let alone run, but he holds his pain dear. As an Inquisitor, it was his duty to enforce the strict laws of faith, and that job entailed bringing pain to others. He is aware of the fact that it makes them miserable, but he feels no guilt, because once a man commits themselves to a vocation, their personal opinion is moot. To him, pain is a precept of faith, and so he welcomes it, but he can see Farnese is still conflicted. He encourages her to confess to him, and she does, expressing her rationale that their hardline Inquisition was only serving to antagonize the people they were supposed to be protecting against them. She was unsure of how torture could ever relate to divine duty, and so Father Mozgus gives her another story, this one with more details. There used to be a holy woman who would go around from village to village, seeking out and caring for the dying until their moment of death, so they would know some peace in life. She loved those people, and the general populace loved her for her selfless service. But one day she was rejected by an old man she found by the side of the road. bestowed. This man told her that his rotting death was evidence of him having lived life itself, and so he did not want the comfort of the warmth she offered him, but the cold embrace of death that he had earned in his mind. Using this story, he tells her that a person can never truly know what can help another person. The woman, who was worshipped as an angel by so many, was rejected as a temptation by this dying man, who took pride in his own rotting corpse. He states that everything is in the scriptures, and it is their belief that this is their guiding star, telling Farnese that they act for God and God alone. This moves her so much that she bows to him in reverence, and Father Mozgus bestows a blessing upon her. But this is about as far as his aura takes him with her. The crow informs Mozgus that it is time to get back to work, and the Inquisitor resumes burning heretics at the stake daily until someone coughs up the location of their hideout. When they do find it, the Holy Iron Chain Knights manage to corner and slaughter the heretics in a bizarre, almost ritualistic fashion. But their true prize is what their ultimate enemy has been chasing after all this while, Casca. After the heretic hunt was decisively concluded, Mozgus began inquiring his captives as to the whereabouts of the rest of their brethren when Farnese walked into his chamber. He congratulated her for a mission well done, and was thoroughly impressed by her faith and tenacity once again, calling their success providence instead. But he wondered why the Black Swordsman, the man she had previously been assigned to capture, would show up in St. Albion. He thought the Guts had a personal grudge against the Holy Iron Chain Knights, but Farnese ended up exposing Casca to the line of fire. And once Father Mozgus noticed her brand of sacrifice, it was only a matter of time before the branded girl was tortured to near death. Mozgus ordered his children to place Casca within an Iron Maiden and question her carefully, but before they could close its doors on her, the contraption exploded. Corporeal pools of blood created from the malice of those that had been slain over the centuries in the Tower of Conviction burst through its walls and started devouring everything in their path, marking the start of the incarnation ceremony. Casca herself survived thanks to the efforts of her demon child, but Father Mozgus and the rest of the inhabitants of the tower did not have a personal astral projector to speak of. Mozgus, Farnese, and the rest of their entourage leg it for the chapel as the torture chamber is overcome with the malice-controlled, people-devouring blood blobs. So overcome are they by their instinct to survive that Mozgus and his disciples don't notice the Black Swordsman nabbing Farnese from amidst them as they make it to the chapel and bar the gates. Mozgus and his men are poised for an attack because the malice of the dead is spreading rapidly throughout the Tower of Conviction. When it arrives at the doors that are being barred by his heavies, the crow begs his master to step back as the doors would not hold. But Father Mozgus is unfazed in the face of death itself. He declares that they shall not fear this trial beset upon them by God or call out to his assistance, but devote themselves entirely to it and prove their divine worth. He calls out for the malice of the dead to repent their sin of defiling this holy ground, and proclaims that it is through death and him that they espouse their faith. But at that moment, the egg-shaped apostle descends into the chapel of the Tower of Conviction. As Mozgus beckons the dead to come at him, the crow beseeches him to look out, just when the egg-shaped apostle injects all of them with his tendrils to turn them into pseudo-apostles. It appears as though this transformation also came attached with a prophecy, because Mozgus realizes he has a key part to play in the incarnation ceremony without having a clue as to its true nature. In chapter 128 of Berserk, both Guts and Zod receive the same prophecy but in different tones. Zod is told by the Falcon of Light, aka Femto, that when the sky falls over the holy ground where blind sheep gather and erect a pillar of fire, the desired will come. Zod desires only the strongest the world has to offer, and after the incarnation ceremony that mantle would be bestowed upon Griffith's incarnated self. So to him, this is akin to a blessing. But for Guts, the prophecy worked differently. The demon child, in essence, said the same thing to him, but the context was different. His exact words were, "Danger, hurry. When the sky falls over the holy ground where blind sheep gather and erect a pillar of fire, hurry, quickly." Before he said this, he showed Guts a vision of Casca spontaneously combusting, and he put two and two together and made his way to St. Albion. The first half of this prophecy is crystal clear, because it uses language we've seen in the story before. In the Holy See prophecy of the Falcon, it is said when the sun dies 5 times, a red lake will appear to the west of the city with a name both old and new. It is a sign that the 5th angel has a light. He is the Falcon of Darkness, the master of the sinful black sheep and the king of the blind white sheep. This is a clear reference to Femto's rebirth as Griffith in the physical world and his subsequent world domination. The sinful black sheep are apostles, who serve him because he is their natural superior as a God Hand member, and the blind white sheep are the humans who remember his exploits during the 100-Year War and revere him for it. In the context of the the ominous prophecy given to us in chapter 128, we can safely say that the place where the sky falls and blind white sheep gather is St. Albion. It is called a holy ground multiple times by various characters in the series and Mozgus himself. The desired, then, is Griffith, who will become the false Falcon of Light in the Age of Darkness. What remains to be explained is how the Pillar of Fire is relevant to it all, and this is where Father Mozgus's transformation becomes relevant. As Isidro and co make their way to the chapel after rescuing Nina, they are surrounded by the malice of the dead, which is blocking their path to safety. All of them prepare to meet their deaths with either grace or fear in their hearts, but none of them do so because Father Mozgus burns the malice away with a column of flame, and we do mean that literally. The Inquisitor, delighted by his newfound power, takes the unconscious Casca, who was stuck within the malice, into his arms and declares he has seen a miracle. Mozgus says that he has seen what the Lord intends for him to do by blessing him with this power, and that is to burn Casca at the stake. Mozgus calls her the ringleader of the evil that is plaguing Albion, and calls burning her at the stake a sign of God's victory for the people to witness. Isidro calls him shady for saying these things, and Jerome quietly prepares for excommunication. But what they don't realize is Mozgus is right in a sense. It is because of the presence of Guts and Casca that the malice within St. Albion had gained such a strong hold in the physical world. The brand of sacrifice was a magnet for dead spirits and other supernatural beings, so it's only natural to expect that two of them being present in a place with such a bloody history would have had dire consequences. The only way to stymie the rampage of the malice would be to take the branded ones out of the equation, and this is where the Pillar of Fire part of the Demon Child's prophecy comes into play. Because Mozgus plans to burn Casca at a stake which has the Holy See's symbol on top of it, it is possible that when the egg-shaped apostle injected him with the pseudo-apostle powers, he also showed him his role in the incarnation ceremony, and thinking it to be a divine task, Father Mozgus obviously committed himself to it entirely. He sicked his disciples on Isidro's party for trying to interfere with his holy task. Clawman uses his newfound strength to hurl a pillar at Jerome and Isidro so hard it blew the tower's walls open, and was about to follow it up with a sure hit when Guts finally arrived at the scene. He chopped the pillar in half with Dragon Slayer, and immediately swung for Mozgus, having seen Casca in his arms. But to everyone's utter disbelief, the Inquisitor and his disciples flew away. Mozgus and his children had been blessed with angelic wings, with which the Inquisitor believed he was reinforcing God's righteousness. He was going to see this witch brought to justice no matter what, and called Guts a fool who didn't believe in God for attacking him. Mozgus's disciples and the Black Swordsman engage in a fierce battle which sees both sides reach a stalemate somehow. The Inquisitor is about to get involved himself when the crow reminds him of his own holy task, and Father Mozgus apologizes for forgetting himself. He spreads his wings, takes the twins with him, and flies off into the night air. Just as he takes off though, Isidro and Puck jump onto his back, unleashing a ferocious attack by the standards of a preschooler at the very least. Father Mozgus is unbothered by this, opting to acknowledge only the partial collapse of the Tower of Conviction, which now looked like the God Hand's altar during the eclipse. But because he doesn't know what that is or why it's important, he gets to work on what he thinks to be important, and that is burning Casca at the stake. As the refugee colonies of Albion start falling prey to the malice in its very ground, a massive brand of sacrifice appears on the same, and bloody blobs start killing everything in sight. In such a nightmarish scene, Father Mozgus descending from the heavens on angel white wings would only make him look like a savior. He uses his God's breath to burn the advancing malice away from his true lambs of God, whom he beseeches to be fearless. Mozgus states that a miracle will be shown to those who hold steadfastly onto their faith, claiming his own form as an example of the manifestation of God's power. The ignorant masses simply accept Mozgus's ascendance as a divine revelation and start looking up to him as a literal guardian angel. When people encounter such a religiously important figure in their lives, they tend to follow their commands without questioning them a lot, and so it didn't surprise us when the blind lambs of God began erecting a pillar of fire to burn the witch whom they saw as the source of their own ills. As Mozgus and his twin disciples held off the malice from forming up around their followers, Casca was tied to the stake, and the egg-shaped apostle began climbing to the summit of the Tower of Conviction. In his dying moments, the apostle was eager to view his perfect world that would soon hatch from his own being, but he was also wistful. He caught a glimpse of Mozgus in his angel form, and wondered if he had met the Inquisitor in his life as a human, would it have gone like the life led by his disciples? Would he have found acceptance and a place for himself in the world and become somebody? The apostle decides that because he didn't, it wasn't meant to be. But these wistful thoughts are perhaps the only ones being spared in a positive spirit towards the Inquisitor, because he had unknowingly evoked the wrath of the Black Swordsman, and that was worse than any form of divine justice could ever hope to be. Casca was saved from her prospective funeral fire by the redemption-seeking Isidro, who literally bungee jump rescued her from fanatics. This obviously pissed off Father Mozgus, as in his mind, he had just failed God himself. So he flew towards Casca at full speed, but his maddened charge was met by Guts and his Dragon Slayer, the impact of which seemed to have killed the Inquisitor. As the observing crowd was about to break down because of losing their beloved angel, Mozgus stood up from the ground and informed the fool Guts that heaven's vengeance was swift, only this time he was in his fully released form. We already know that Mozgus had flame breath and wings in his regular human form after being injected by the egg-shaped apostle and being granted demonic energy, but in his released form, he truly looked more like a demon than an angel. His entire body was covered in pearlescent scales, which were impervious to damage, and his wings now took the shape of two massive fists instead. He could manipulate these fists into creating multiple smaller appendages, giving him insane range and versatility in battle. His hide was so thick that even Dragon Slayer, which chops men in full plate armor in half, couldn't make a dent on it. The only reason why Mozgus was knocked out instead of outright dead after Guts' first strike, as he should have been, was because of this apostle power, but the Inquisitor's fanaticism led him to believe it was his Bible instead. Sure, he gives his attacks really corny names like God's Breath, God Thousand Fist Cannon, and God Pressure, but he is by far one of the strongest opponents Guts has gone up against, including many full-fledged apostles. He explains to the Black Swordsman how his faith kept him safe before directing the twins to bring Casca to her fate and mourning the loss of his other disciples with literal tears of blood. Father Mozgus proceeds to attack Guts with his cannon and breath, and even a direct stab into his oral cavity with Dragon Slayer cannot get the Black Swordsman an advantage. What does give him a reprieve is the fact that Isidro takes out the twins, which only drives Mozgus deeper into despair, and therefore rage, making him susceptible to mistakes. Guts was counting on the Pseudo revealing a weakness of his, and that's exactly what he does in his self-righteousness. As he is pummeling the swordsman with his demonic powers, Father Mozgus asks the Black Swordsman why he refuses to acknowledge God's divine decrees. He points out that everyone gathered in St. Albion, as one heart, only desired salvation through God's victory. He asks Guts if he really thinks that the life of one evil witch is worth that of thousands of true believers, to which the Black Swordsman replies with venomous words. Guts mocks the idea of prayer and faith itself, and says that tens of thousands clinging to the sacrifice of one woman as their salvation was a laughable idea to him. This insult to prayer, the very foundation of faith according to Mozgus, was unacceptable to him. He declared his intention to make Guts repent for his blasphemy and got ready to strike him down once and for all, but this is where he made a crucial mistake. Father Mozgus exposed his weak spot to the Black Swordsman. The first thrust that Guts had struck him with before he assumed his released form had left a slight fissure squarely in the middle of his torso, and so it would come to pass that the very place that had once been protected by scripture now served as Mozgus's Achilles heel. The Inquisitor unleashed a final barrage of fist cannons onto Guts and applied God pressure on him as well. He was about to cleanse his heretical soul with the fiery God's breath, but the Black Swordsman beat him to the punch. Guts exploited Mozgus's long-winded nature to drive Dragon Slayer deep into that exposed chink, so hard that it literally knocked the feathers off the Inquisitor's back. Stunned and broken, Father Mozgus's final words are those of anticipation at getting to finally meet his maker, proclaiming that he now comes to the Lord's domain. But before he does that, he will use his cleansing flame to bring the world's greatest evil along with him as he charges up God breath one last time. Guts has had quite enough of Mozgus's insanity for a day, however. He simply uses Dragon Slayer as a lever to hurl the dying pseudo-apostle's body off the Tower of Conviction, so it could land amongst his beloved lambs and rest there. As he falls through the sky, Father Mozgus loses his scaled armor first, then his angelic wings, as his human body flattens on the earth below and is subsumed within the bloody malice of St. Albion. This is the last time we see Father Mozgus show up in the story, but having learnt all of this information about his lifetime, we can make a few educated guesses as to how he ended up the way he did. So let's now take a look into the true origins of Berserk's craziest villain. A man who found faith as his only salvation, Father Mozgus's true origins. A couple of things are rather clear by the way the story's characters interact with Father Mozgus. Number one, they're aware of his brutal reputation, and number two, he's been at his inquisitorial work for at least a decade, if not more. The first is apparent from the moment Mozgus enters the story, but the second statement is derived from an offhand comment made by the Crow when Farnese visits Father Mozgus during his hours of prostration. The Crow mentions that for the past decade, Mozgus had been performing 1,000 prostrations a day and night in an expression of his faith. His worship was so fervent that despite losing feeling and functionality in both legs, he continues to throw himself into prostration daily and without fail. The very act of prostration is one that is performed in reverence to a higher being, and so it makes sense that a fanatic like Mozgus does 1,000 of them at maximum velocity every day and night of their lives. What's interesting to us is the timeline that the crow gives us, 10 years. It is very difficult to make out just when the crow himself met Father Mozgus, because his age isn't clearly reflected in his origin flashback, but it is clear that he has known the Inquisitor for a long time, and been raised by him in more than one way. The same goes for every one of his disciples. They were taken in at some point in their young lives and molded by the priest into the tools they are today. So we can assume that Mozgus's hardcore fanaticism has only been a recent thing, because we don't know who else is face-planting themselves that hard on the floor in the name of God in the story, okay? And the pontiff does not count. But it is more than likely that he had been a part of the clergy all his life, because he seems to be aware of things that only longtime members are privy to. His story about Geiseric's sage is a key example, and so is the fact that his interpretation of the Holy See's role in the world lines up with that of the higher-up clergymen. It is also clear that he has been working as an inquisitor for about as long as he has been offering prostration, because otherwise the casualties attributed to him would have less of an impact if carried out across a longer period of time. 500 confirmed burnings and thousands of other deaths besides in 10 years of Inquisition is definitely more terrifying than the same thing happening over 50 years, isn't it? So it is questioning the source of his fanaticism that holds the key to understanding his origins, and we think that source is connected to his favorite pastime, torture. What makes a person capable of inflicting great pain onto others? The fact that they have been subjected to great pain themselves. Every one of Mozgus's disciples have two things in common. 1. The fact that they were shunned by society because of how they looked, and 2. The fact that respect and love for Mozgus, despite his harsh disciplining, is what gave them salvation. Before meeting the Inquisitor, they had endured torture in multiple forms: physical, emotional, and mental. But it was only after meeting him and being given their divine duty that they felt vindicated in existing for the first time. It is quite possible, or rather likely, that Mozgus had a similar backstory himself. When he is lecturing Farnese about the sacred duties of an inquisitor, he lets slip the fact that he can only do what he does out of an ironclad belief in his holy mission. If he allowed his personal opinions to taint his religious work, then he too might be thinking the same way she is, that torture is not a tool of God, but a weapon of chaos. But the reason that Farnese herself became a pyrophiliac was because of her distinct lack of affection, power, and control over her own life. She was emotionally smothered by her distant family, to a point where burning heretics became the only thing that could stimulate her. And while Mozgus might not have such depraved cravings as Farnese, it is not unthinkable that he had a similar experience in his life. Pain is a response to something that our mind thinks is undesirable for our current health and well-being, but when that is all you can see and feel, you become primed to inflict it upon others without a second thought. That is Father Mozgus's true origins. At some point in his life, a young clergyman, possibly the son of a noble, is captured by enemies and tortured into insanity. His only salvation? God. So what does he do when he is freed? Becomes an inquisitor and uses that same pain he felt all those years ago to bring wrongdoers to justice in his own way. Father Mozgus must have been someone deprived of power and faith in his early life, because those are the building blocks for the kind of fanaticism he has displayed in Berserk. After a certain turning point event occurred, he started collecting misfits and performing daily prostration in an attempt to express his undying faith to God. But the God of Berserk treads that fine line between good and evil on a unisite, because it's very likely that the Holy See scriptures are a product of the idea of evil, not an antithesis to it. Much of what has been written in it has been shown to be true for demonkind, and in that light, it makes Mozgus's ideology about religion line up perfectly with Berserk's in-universe setting. In a filthy world soaked in blood and guts, how else do you show your faith, if not through blind loyalty and unflinching violence? That is what the man called Mozgus must have realized before he began his terrible inquisition. Once he did, there was no turning back, and by the end, he truly believed in his mission and its divine mandate, despite the fact that he became an accessory to a literal demon's ascension. Marvelous verdict. Father Mozgus is the embodiment of the blind white sheep, and that is scary when you realize that unlike the rest of the sheep, his breath can actually melt your face off. We're glad that the only time he returned was as a washing stone in the corridor of dreams, because we don't know how happy we would have been to see him again. As a character, he was so over the top that his rage would come off as goofy comic relief at times, and we think that was intentional. But as a villain, he is downright chilling because of just how much he truly believes in what he says. Mozgus doesn't just think he's that guy, he carries himself like it, and that is what should scare you the most about him, not the fact that his rage face has more veins than John Cena's arms. He personifies everything dangerous about religious fervor and misinterpretation of doctrine, because we know through history how bad that can go for the world, and we don't want to repeat the same things all over again, even if time flows in a spiral and not a circle. That's it for now, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. This has been Corey Whelan for Marvelous Videos. Have a good one, be safe out there, and thanks for watching.